You know, it's hard to recall that in our day of iPods, satellite communication, and all the rest, this is still an agricultural nation and always has been. Today, of course, it's wheat, soybean, hog bellies, beef. But from 1700 to 1850, those crops were cotton and tobacco. They were considered luxury crops, a rarity at the time. Cotton was only grown in a great abundance in India, Egypt, and the British colonies of the South here in North America. Of course, tobacco is a Native American product, and when these things were introduced to Europe, the demand rose. When the United States became independent, it rose even more. When the Napoleonic Wars and the Wars of the French Revolution broke out, our merchant marine grew tenfold and carried our products to all the warring parties, and millions were brought into the foreign market. Of course, the great moral disparity of this was that the system in the South was driven by slave labor. Slavery was introduced into North America by the Spanish, and it's because these two crops were intensely what we call labor-intensive crops to produce. It required many, many field hands, and there weren't that many indentured servants to do it. And so, unfortunately, we were bringing in millions and making the United States wealthy and rich, but committing, in my estimation, the estimation of most people, a great moral travesty. Now, when the Great Peace hit Europe, right after the Napoleonic period, the demand grew even higher. When the cotton gin came out to clean the cotton fibers, it was thought that slave production, the production of goods by slavery rather would go down, but actually went up because those field hands could be freed to plant even greater acreage. The southern plantation owners then looked west, particularly to the lands acquired from the war with Mexico, which had the same temperate climate, and perhaps cotton and tobacco could be transplanted there. Key to all of this was a curious balance in the United States Senate. The North was largely against slavery, and the South was largely for it. The North had the greater population, and so in the House of Representatives, they usually prevailed in numbers. As a matter of fact, they always did. But in the Senate, of course, they were equally divided. For the better part of the period 1800 to 1850, the number of slave states equaled the number of free states. That meant if there was any movement by anti-slavery or abolitionist forces to pass legislation outlawing slavery, it could be blocked at least by a tie in the Senate. This desperation could be seen in the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri came in as a slave state, and they scratched around and finally found a new territory, named it Maine, and brought that in as a free state. Well, how long could this go on? Every time you turn around, another territory has the prerequisite population to apply for statehood, and then everybody goes ballistic. Well, they want to be free or slave. In 1850, California applied for admittance to the Union as a free state, and all heck broke out in the Senate. Such noble people as Calhoun, Webster, Seward endeavored to find a solution to this, couldn't, and then enter Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant of Illinois, who came up with the Compromise of 1850. California would be admitted as a free state, but the South would get a fugitive slave law that would allow deputized posses to enter northern states looking for runaway slaves. Also, slavery would be legalized in New Mexico and Utah. The imbalance was still there. Every time another state applied for admittance, it got worse and worse and worse, as witnessed by the Civil War that broke out in Kansas. Okay? This brings us up to 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. This day and age, there was no popular election of U.S. senators. It went to the state legislature. But federal senatorial prospects campaigned in their state nonetheless. This is a very interesting, well, there are some very interesting parallels between the rise of Abraham Lincoln and Barack Obama. Both came from relative obscurity and by the power of their oratory, ascended a national level where they were well known. Interesting, people took shorthand of these debates in all 7 areas of Illinois where they were conducted. And in the South, all the remarks made by Stephen A. Douglas, who came out for popular sovereignty, which was how he solved the compromise of 1850, the plebiscite, people would vote whether to let it be slavery free. All of his comments were dusted off, all the mistakes were edited out, and it read perfectly. All the mistakes in Lincoln's speech were left in. In the North, the exact opposite took place, and Lincoln's oratory was dusted off very beautifully, and all of Douglas's mistakes were left in. So the main crux here is, will Douglas's philosophy of popular sovereignty, every new territory gets to vote, should it be slave or free, will that be the wave of the future? Or Lincoln? Lincoln wanted to stop slavery where it existed and not let it spread further. There's a great moral battle here. But don't forget, many people who had moral qualms about slavery, a lot of people did, obviously, were also making vast amounts of money off of the trade that it brought. Now, I have to slip into my role as the introducer. 1858. George Ford, Democratic Party leader. Bingo, 1858, 1850. George Ford, Democratic Party. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, gentlemen, distinguished friends and visitors here on the platform. Ladies and gentlemen of this magnificent audience, welcome to this debate between Judge Stephen A. Douglas and the Honorable Abraham Lincoln, candidates for the U.S. Senate. Please give both candidates your respectful and courteous attention. It is my privilege and a high honor to introduce a man who has, with unswerving fidelity, upheld the ideals that have made the American Democratic Party, and if I may say so, have made our great nation what it is today. The leader and exemplar of democracy in all the world, I speak of a man who is a great orator, a great fighter, and a great statesman, champion of the cause of popular sovereignty among these United States. Ladies and gentlemen, the little giant, the Honorable Judge Stephen A. Douglas.
Ladies and gentlemen, 4 years ago I appeared before you for the purpose of defending my political action upon the compromise measures of 1850 and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. Those of you who were present then will recall that I vindicated myself for supporting those 2 measures because they rested upon the great fundamental principle that the people of each state and each territory have the right and ought to be permitted to exercise the right of deciding their own domestic concerns in their own way, subject to no limitation other than that which the Constitution of the United States imposes upon them. The Kansas and Nebraska bill stated in so many words that it was the true intended meaning of the act not to impose slavery on any territory, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form their own domestic laws and regulations in their own way, subject only to the Constitution of the United States. For the last 4 years, I have devoted all my energies in public and in private to commend that principle to the American people. Whatever may be said in condemnation or support of my political actions, I apprehend that no honest man will doubt the fidelity with which, under all circumstances, I have stood by it. But Mr. Lincoln's Republican Party is availing itself of every unworthy means in this contest to carry the election, because its leaders know that if they let this chance slip, they will never have another, and their hope of making Illinois a Republican state will be blasted forever. Now, let me ask you, Does the country have any interest in sustaining this organization known as the Republican Party? That party is unlike all other political organizations in this country. All other parties have been national in character, have avowed their principles alike in the slave and free states, in Kentucky as well as in Illinois, in Louisiana as well as Massachusetts. Such was the case with the old Whig Party. Such is and was the case with the Democratic Party. Whigs and Democrats could proclaim their principles boldly and fearlessly in the North and in the South, in the East and in the West. Wherever the Constitution ruled and the American flag waved over American soil. But now you have a sectional organization, a party which appeals to the northern section of the Union against the southern, a party which appeals to northern passion, northern pride, northern ambition, and northern prejudices against southern people, southern states, and southern institutions. The leaders of that party hope that they will be able to unite the northern states in one great sectional party. And inasmuch as the North is the strongest section, that they will thus be enabled to outvote, conquer, govern, and control the South. Hence you find that they now make speeches advocating principles and measures which cannot be defended in any slaveholding state in the Union. Permit me to say to you in perfect good humor, but in all seriousness, that no political creed is sound which cannot be proclaimed fearlessly in every state of the Union where the federal Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Not only is this Republican Party unable to proclaim its principles alike in the North and in the South, in the free states and in the slave states, it cannot even proclaim them in the same forms and give them the same strength and meaning in all parts of the same state. My friend Lincoln finds it difficult to manage a debate in the center part of the state, where there is a mixture of men from the North and the South. In the extreme northern part of Illinois, he can proclaim as bold and radical an abolitionism as ever Giddings, Lovejoy, or Garrison enunciated. But when he gets down a little further south, he claims he's an old-line Whig, a disciple of Henry Clay, and declares that he still adheres to the old Whig doctrine and has nothing what to do with abolitionism or Negro equality or Negro citizenship. I once before hinted this of Mr. Lincoln in a public speech, and at Charleston, he defied me to show that there was any difference between his speeches in the North and in the South, and that they were not in strict harmony. I will now call your attention to two of them, and you can say whether you would be apt to believe that the same man ever uttered both. In a speech in reply to me at Chicago, Mr. Lincoln, in speaking of the equality of the Negro with the white man, used the following language. I should like to know if, taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are created equal on principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why may not another man say it does not mean a German? If the Declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who is so bold as to do it? If it is not true, let us tear it out. You find that Mr. Lincoln there proposed that if the doctrine of the Declaration of Independence, declaring all men to be born equal, did not include the Negro, and put him on equality with the white man, that we should take the statute book and tear it out. He there took the ground that the Negro race is included in the Declaration of Independence as the equal of the white race, and that there could be no such thing as a distinction between the races, making one superior and the other inferior. I read now from the same speech. My friends, he says, I have detained you about as long as I desire to do, and I have only to say, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and that race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position, discarding our standard that we have left us. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. Now, I have no doubt that you think this is right. But the Lincoln men in Cole, Tazewell, and Sangamon do not think it is right. In the conclusion of that same speech, talking to the Chicago abolitionists, he said, "I leave you hoping that the lamp of liberty will burn in your bosoms until there shall no longer be a doubt that all men are created free and equal." So, you are going to vote for Lincoln because he holds that doctrine. I will not blame you for supporting him on that ground, but I will show you, in immediate contrast with that doctrine, what Mr. Lincoln said down in Egypt in order to get votes in that locality where they do not hold such a doctrine. Mr. Lincoln, referring to the subject, used the following language: "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the black and white races. That I am not, nor never have been, in favor of making voters of the free Negroes, or jurors, or qualifying them to hold office, or having them to marry with white people. I will say, in addition, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I suppose will forever forbid the two races living together upon terms of social and political equality. And, inasmuch as they cannot so live, that while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any man, am in favor of the superior position being assigned to the white man." Fellow citizens, you find men hurrahing for Lincoln and saying he did right, when in one part of the state he stood up for a Negro equality, and in another part, for political effect, discarded the doctrine and declared that there always must be a superior and inferior race. Abolitionists up north are expected and required to vote for Lincoln because he goes for the equality of the races, holding that by the Declaration of Independence, the white man and the Negro are created equal and endowed by divine law with that equality. And down south, he tells the old Whigs, the Kentuckians, Virginians, and Tennesseans, that there is a physical difference between the races, making one superior and the other inferior, and that he is in favor of maintaining the superiority of the white race over the Negro. Now, how can you reconcile these two positions of Lincoln? He is to be voted for in the South as a pro-slavery man, and he is to be voted for in the North as an abolitionist. I ask you, my friends, why cannot the Republicans avow their principles alike everywhere? I would despise myself if I thought I was procuring your votes by concealing my opinions and by avowing one set of principles in one part of the state and another set in another part. If I do not truly and honorably represent your feelings and principles, then I ought not to be your senator. And I will never conceal my opinions or modify or change them a hair's breadth in order to get votes. I tell you that this Chicago doctrine of Lincoln's, declaring the Negro and the white man made equal by the Declaration of Independence and by divine providence, is a monstrous heresy. The signers of the Declaration of Independence never dreamed of the Negro when they were writing that doctrine. They referred to white men, to men of European birth and European descent, when they declared the equality of all men. I see a gentleman in the crowd there shaking his head. I would remind him that when Thomas Jefferson wrote that declaration, he was the owner, and so continued until his death, of a large number of slaves. Did he mean to say in that document that his Negro slaves, whom he held and treated as property, were created his equal by divine law, and that he was violating the law of God every day of his life by continuing to hold them as slaves? It must be borne in mind that when that declaration was put forth, every one of the 13 colonies was a slaveholding colony, and every man who signed that declaration represented a slaveholding constituency. Recall also that none of them emancipated his slaves, much less put them on an equality with himself after signing the Declaration. On the contrary, they all continued to hold their Negroes as slaves throughout the Revolutionary War. Now, do you believe? Are you willing to have it said that every man who signed the Declaration of Independence declared the Negro to be his equal, and yet was hypocrite enough to continue to hold him as a slave in spite of divine law? And yet, when you say the Declaration of Independence includes the Negro, you charge the signers of it with hypocrisy. I say to you frankly, in my opinion, this government was made by our fathers on the white basis. It was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and was intended to be administered by white men for all time to come. But while I hold that under our Constitution and political system, the Negro is not a citizen, cannot be a citizen, ought not to be a citizen, it does not follow by any means that he should be a slave. On the contrary, it does follow that the Negro, as an inferior race, ought to possess every right, every privilege, every immunity which he can safely exercise, consistent with the safety of the community where he lives. Humanity requires, and Christianity commands, that you shall extend to every inferior being, every dependent being, all the privileges, immunities, and advantages which can be granted to him, consistent with the safety of society. If you ask me the nature and extent of these privileges, I answer that that is a question which the people of each state must decide for themselves. Illinois has decided that question for herself. We have decided that the Negro shall not be a slave, nor shall he be a citizen. Kentucky holds a different doctrine. New York holds one different from either, and Maine one different from all. Virginia, in her policy on this question, differs in many respects from the others, and so on, until there are hardly two states whose policy is exactly alike in regard to the relation of the white man and the Negro. Nor can you reconcile them and make them alike. Each state must do as it pleases. Illinois had as much right to adopt a policy which we have on that subject as Kentucky had to adopt a different policy. The great principle of this country is that each state has the right to do as it pleases on all these questions. No other state or power on earth has the right to interfere with us or complain of us because our system differs from theirs. But Mr. Lincoln cannot be made to understand, and those who are determined to vote for him, no matter if he is a pro-slavery man in the South and a Negro equality advocate in the North, cannot be made to understand how it is in a territory that the people can do as they please on the slavery question under the Dred Scott decision. If the people of a territory want slavery, they make friendly legislation to introduce it. But if they do not want it, they withhold protection from it, and then it cannot exist there. Such was the view taken by many Southern men when the Nebraska bill passed. They held that slavery could never be forced upon a people who did not want it. I hold that in this country, there is no power on the face of the globe that can force an institution on an unwilling people. The great fundamental principle of our government is that the people of each state and each territory shall be left perfectly free to decide for themselves what shall be the nature and character of their institutions. When this government was made, it was based on that principle. At the time of its formation, there were 12 slave-holding states and 1 free state. Suppose this doctrine of Mr. Lincoln and the Republicans of uniformity of laws in all the states on the subject of slavery had prevailed. Suppose Mr. Lincoln himself had been a member of the convention that framed the Constitution, and he had risen in that august body, and addressing the father of his country, had said as he did at Springfield, A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be absolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. What do you think would have been the result? Suppose he had made that convention believe that doctrine and they had acted upon it. What do you think would have been the result? Do you believe the one free state would have outvoted the 12 slave states and abolished slavery? On the contrary, would not the 12 slaveholding states have outvoted the one free state and under his doctrine have fastened slavery on it by an irrevocable constitutional provision upon every inch of the American Republic? Thus you see that the doctrine that he now advocates, if proclaimed at the beginning of the government, would have established slavery everywhere throughout the American continent. And are you willing, now that we have the majority section, to exercise a power which we would never have submitted to when we were in the minority? If the southern states had attempted to control our institutions and make the states all slave when they had the power, I ask, would you have submitted to it? Then, my friends, I say to you that there is but one path to peace in the Republic: to administer this government as our fathers made it, divided into free and slave states, allowing each state to decide for itself whether it wants slavery or not. If Illinois will decide the slavery question for herself and mind her own business and leave her neighbors alone, we will be at peace with Kentucky and every other slave state. And if every other state will do the same, there will be peace in the North and in the South and in the whole Union.
The following remarks were from James Knott. Ladies and gentlemen, your next speaker in this contest for a seat in the United States Senate needs no introduction to the state of Illinois. North, south, east, or west, Mr. Lincoln's skills as a lawyer, as a representative of the United States Congress, and as a champion of the noblest principles of our democracy are known to us all. Therefore, and without further ado, it gives me the deepest pleasure to present the Honorable Abraham Lincoln.
My fellow citizens, a very large portion of the speech which Judge Douglas has just addressed to you has previously been delivered and put in print. I don't mean this for a hit upon the judge at all. There has been an opportunity afforded to the public to see our respective views in a large portion of the speech which he has just delivered. I make these remarks for the purposes of excusing myself for passing over the entire ground the judge has traversed. I, however, desire to take up some of the points he has attended to and ask your attention to them. The judge has alluded to the Declaration of Independence and insisted that Negroes are not included in that declaration, and that it is a slander upon the framers of that instrument to suppose that the Negro was meant therein. And he asks you, is it possible to believe that Mr. Jefferson, who penned that immortal paper, could have supposed himself applying the language of that instrument to the Negro race and yet held a portion of that race in slavery? Would he have not have once have freed them? I only have to remark upon this part of the judge's speech, that I believe the entire records of the world, from the date of Declaration of Independence to within 3 years ago, may be searched in vain for one single affirmation, from one single man that the Negro was not included in the Declaration of Independence. I think I may defy Judge Douglas to show that Jefferson ever said so, that Washington ever said so, that any president ever said so, that any member of Congress ever said so, that any living man upon the whole face of the earth ever said so, until the present policy of the Democratic Party in regards to slavery had to invent that affirmation. And I will remind Judge Douglas and this audience that while Mr. Jefferson was the owner of slaves, as he undoubtedly was, in speaking upon this very subject, he used the strong language that he trembled for his country when he remembered that God was just. And I will pay the highest premium in my power to Judge Douglas if he will show that in all of his life, he ever uttered a sentiment at all akin to that of Jefferson. Now, a few words in regards to these extracts from speeches of mine, which Judge Douglas has read to you, which he supposes are in a very great contrast with each other. Well, those speeches have been before the public for a considerable time. If there was any inconsistency in them, if there was any problem in them, the public would have been able to detect it. When speaking on this subject, the judge says that I make speeches of one sort for the people of the northern end of the state and a different sort for the southern portion of the state. He assumes that I do not understand that my speeches will be put in print and read north and south. I knew all the while that the speech that I made at Jonesboro and the one that I made at Charleston would all be put in print, and all the reading and intelligent men in the community would be able to see them and know all about my opinions. And I have not supposed, and I do not now suppose, that there is any conflict whatever between them. But the judge will have it that if we do not confess there is a sort of inequality between the white and black races, which justifies us in making them slaves, we must then insist there is a degree of equality that requires us to make them our wives. Now, I have all the while taken a broad distinction in regard to that matter. And that is all there is in these different speeches which he arrays here, and the entire reading of either of the speeches will show that that distinction was made. Perhaps by taking two parts of the same speech, he could have got up as much conflict as he has found. Now, I have all the while maintained, so far as it should be insisted, that there was an equality between the white and black races that should produce a perfect social and political equality. It was an impossibility. And this you have seen in my printed speeches. And with it I have said that in their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as proclaimed in that old declaration, the inferior races are our equals. And these declarations I have constantly made in reference to the moral question to contemplate and consider when we are legislating for any new country which is not already cursed with the actual presence of the evil slavery. I have never manifested any impatience with the necessities that spring from the actual presence of black people amongst us and the actual existence of slavery where it does now exist. But I have insisted that in legislating for new countries where it does not exist, there is no other just rule other than that of the moral and abstract right. With reference to those new countries, those maxims as to the right of people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were the just rules to be constantly referred to. There is no misunderstanding this, except by men interested to misunderstand it. The judge has also detained us a while in regard to the distinction between his party and our party. His party assumes to be a national party. Ours a sectional one. He does this in asking the question whether this country has an interest in the maintenance of the Republican Party. He assumes that our party is altogether sectional, that the party to which he adheres is national. And the argument is that no party can be a rightful party, can be based upon rightful principles, unless it can announce its principles everywhere. I presume that Judge Douglas could not go into Russia and announce the doctrine of our national democracy. He could not denounce the doctrine of kings and emperors and monarchies in Russia. And it may be true of this country that in some places we may not be able to proclaim a doctrine as clearly true as the truth of democracy, because there is a section so directly opposed to it that they will not tolerate us in doing so. Well, I understood that at one time the people of Chicago would not let Judge Douglas preach a certain favorite doctrine of his. I commend to his consideration the question whether he takes that as a test of the unsoundness of what he wanted to preach. There is another thing to which I wish to ask attention for a little while on this occasion. What has always been the evidence brought forward to prove that the Republican Party is a sectional party? Well, the main one was that the southern portion of the Union, the people did not let the Republicans proclaim their doctrines amongst them. That has been the main difference brought forward, that they had no supporters or substantially none in the slave states. The South have not taken hold of our principles as we announce them, nor does Judge Douglas now grapple with those principles. We have a Republican state platform laid down in Springfield in June last, stating our position all the way through the questions before the country. We are now far advanced in this canvass. If he had great confidence that our principles were wrong, he would take hold of them and demonstrate them to be wrong. But he does not do so. The only evidence he has of their being wrong is in the fact that there are people who will not allow us to preach them. I ask again, is that the way to test the soundness of any doctrine? I ask his attention to the fact that by the rule of nationality, he himself is fast becoming sectional. I ask his attention to the fact that his speeches would not go as current now south of the Ohio River as they have formerly gone there. I ask his attention to the fact that he congratulates himself today that all the Democrats of the free states are agreeing with him, while he omits to tell us that any of the Democrats of the slave states agree with him. If he has not thought of this, I commend to his own consideration the evidence of his own declaration on this day of his becoming sectional too. Oh, I see the day rapidly approaching. Whatever may be the result of this ephemeral contest between Judge Douglas and myself, I see the day rapidly approaching when his pill of sectionalism, which he has been thrusting down the throats of Republicans for years past, will be crowded down his own throat. Now, in regard to what Judge Douglas said in the beginning of his speech about the Compromise of 1850 containing the principle of the Nebraska Bill. Although I have often expressed my views upon this subject, yet as I have not done so in this canvass, I will, if you please, detain you a little with them. I have always maintained, so far as I was able, that there was nothing of the principle of the Nebraska Bill in the Compromise of 1850 at all. Nothing whatever. Where can you find the principle of the Nebraska Bill in that compromise? If anywhere, in the two pieces of the compromise, organizing the territories of New Mexico and Utah. It was expressly provided in these two acts that when they came to be admitted into the Union, they should be admitted with or without slavery, as they should choose by their own constitutions. Nothing was said in either of those acts as to what was to be done in relation to slavery during the territorial existence of those territories, while Henry Clay constantly made the declaration, Judge Douglas recognizing him as a leader, that, in this opinion, the old Mexican laws would control that question during the territorial existence, and that these old Mexican laws excluded slavery. Well, how can that be used as a principle for declaring that during the territorial existence, as well as time of framing the Constitution, the people, if you please, might have slaves if they wanted them? I am not discussing the question whether it is right or wrong, but how are the New Mexican and Utah laws patterns for the Nebraska Bill? I maintain that the organization of Utah and New Mexico did not establish a general principle at all. It had no features of establishing a general principle. The acts to which I have referred were a part of a general system of compromise. They did not lay down what was proposed as a regular policy for that territory, only an agreement in this particular case to do in that way, because other things were done that were to be a compensation for it. They were allowed to come into that shape because in another way, it was paid for, considering that as a part of that system of measures called the Compromise of 1850, which finally included half a dozen acts. It included the admission of California as a free state, which had been kept out of the Union for half a year because it had formed a free constitution. It included the settlement of the boundary of Texas, which had been undefined before, which was in itself a slavery question. It included the abolition of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. It included the passage of a new fugitive slave law. All these things were put together. And though passed in separate acts, were nevertheless in legislation, as the speeches of the time will show, made to depend upon each other. Each got votes, with the understanding that the other measures were to pass. And by this system of compromise, in that series of measures, those two bills, the New Mexico and Utah bills, were passed. And I say for that reason, they could not be used as model for all territories, for framing all future territories. And I have the evidence of this in the fact that Judge Douglas, a year afterward, or more than a year afterward, when he first introduced the bills for framing new territories, did not attempt to follow these bills of New Mexico and Utah. And even when he introduced this Nebraska bill, I think you will find that he did not exactly follow them. My own opinion is that a thorough investigation will show most plainly that the New Mexico and Utah bills were a part of a system of compromise and not designed as patterns for future territorial legislation, and that this Nebraska bill did not follow them as a pattern at all. Yeah, but I do not wish to dwell at great length upon this branch of the discussion. The judge tells us in proceeding that he is opposed to making any odious distinctions between the free and slave states. I am altogether unaware that the Republicans are in favor of making any odious distinctions between the free and slave states. But there still is a difference between Judge Douglas and his friends and the Republicans on the other. I suppose that the real difference between Judge Douglas and his friends and the Republicans on the contrary is that the judge is not in favor of making any difference between slavery and liberty. That he is in favor of eradicating, pressing out of view, the question of preference in this country for free or slave institutions. And consequently, every sentiment he utters discards the idea that there is anything wrong in slavery. If you will take the judge's sentences and speeches and select the short and pointed sentences expressed by him as his declaration that he don't care whether slavery is voted up or voted down, you will see at once that this is perfectly logical if you do not agree that slavery is wrong. If you do agree it is wrong, Judge Douglas cannot logically say that he don't care whether a vote is voted up or voted down. Judge Douglas that declares that if a community wants slavery, they have a right to have it. He insists that upon the score of equality, the owners of slaves and the owners of property or horses or every other sort of property should be alike and hold them alike in a new territory. Well, that is perfectly logical if the two species of property are alike and are equally founded in like. But if you admit that one of them is wrong, you cannot institute an equality between right and wrong. And from this difference of sentiment, the belief on the part that the institution is wrong, and a policy springing from that belief, which looks to the arrest of the enlargement of that wrong. And this other sentiment, that it is no wrong, and a policy sprung from that sentiment, which will tolerate no idea of preventing that wrong from growing larger, and looks to there never being an end of it. Through all the existence of things arises the real difference between Judge Douglas and his friends and the Republicans on the contrary. Now, I confess myself as belonging to that class in the country who contemplates slavery as a moral, social, and political evil, having due regard for its actual presence amongst us and the difficulties of getting rid of it in any satisfactory way, and look hopefully to the time when, as a wrong, it may come to an end. I have said once before, and I will repeat it now, that Mr. Clay, when he was once answering an objection to the Colonization Society, that it had a tendency to the ultimate emancipation of the slaves, said, those who would repress all tendencies to liberty and ultimate emancipation must do more than put down the benevolent efforts of the Colonization Society. They must go back to the era of our liberty and independence and muzzle the cannon that thunders its annual joyous return. They must blot out the moral lights around us. They must penetrate the human soul and eradicate the love of reason and the love of liberty. And I do think, I repeat it though I said it before on a former occasion, that Judge Douglas and whoever like him teaches that the Negro has no share in the Declaration of Independence, humble as it may be, is going back to the era of our independence. And so far as in him lies, muzzling the cannon that thunders its annual joyous return, that he is blowing out the moral lights around us when he contends that whoever wants slavery has a right to have it, that he is penetrating, so far as lies in his power, the human soul, and eradicating the light of reason and the love of liberty, when he is in every possible way preparing the public mind by his vast influence for making the institution of slavery perpetual and national. This is but my opinion, and the opinion of one very humble man, but it is my opinion that the Dred Scott decision, as it is, would never have been made in its present form if the party that made it had not been sustained previously by the elections. My own opinion is that the new Dred Scott decision, deciding against the right of people of the states to exclude slavery, will never be made if that party is not sustained by elections. I believe further it is just as sure as to be made as tomorrow is to come if that party shall be sustained. Now, there is, my friends, only one other point which I will call your attention for the time I have remaining. And perhaps I will not occupy the entire time I have, as that one point may not take me directly through it. Among the interrogatories that Judge Douglas propounded to me at Freeport, there was one in about this language. Are you opposed to the acquisition of any further territory to the United States unless slavery shall be first prohibited therein? Well, I answered as I thought, in this way, that I am not generally opposed to the acquisition of additional territory, and that I would support a proposition for the addition of new territory, according as my supporting it was or was not calculated to aggravate the slavery question amongst us. I then proposed to Judge Douglas another interrogatory, which was correlative to this. Are you in favor of acquiring additional territory in disregard of how it may affect us upon the slavery question? Judge Douglas answered it. Oh, that is in his own way he answered it. The substance of his answer was this: that this country would continue to expand, that it would need additional territory, that it was as absurd to suppose that we could continue upon our present territory, enlarging in population as we are, as it would be to hoop a boy 12 years old of age and expect him to grow to man's size without bursting the hoops. I believe it was something like that. Consequently, he was in favor of the acquisition of further territory as fast as we might need it, in disregard of how it may affect us upon this slavery question. Now, I do not say this is giving his exact language, but he said so substantially, that he would leave the question of slavery where the territory was acquired to be settled by the people of the acquired territory. If the judge's policy upon this question succeeds and gets fairly settled down until all opposition is crushed out, the next thing will be a grab for the poor territory of Mexico, an invasion of the rich lands of South America, and then the adjoining islands will follow, each one of which promises additional slave fields. It is to be remembered, though, that this power of acquiring additional territory is a power confided to the President and the Senate of the United States. It is a power not under the control of the representatives of the people, any further than they, the President and the Senate, can be considered as representatives of the people. Let me illustrate that by a case we have in our history. When we acquired the territory from Mexico in the Mexican War, the House of Representatives, composed of the immediate representatives of the people, all the time insisted that the territory thus to be acquired should be brought in upon that condition that slavery should be forever prohibited therein, upon the terms and in the language that slavery had been prohibited from coming into this country. That was insisted upon constantly, and never failed to call forth an assurance that any territory thus acquired should have that prohibition in it, so far as the House of Representatives was concerned. But at last, the President and the Senate acquired the territory without asking the House of Representatives anything about it, and took it without that prohibition. They have the power of acquiring territory without the immediate representatives of the people being called upon to say anything about it, and thus furnishing a very apt and powerful means of bringing new territory into the Union. And when it is once brought into this country, involving us anew in this slavery agitation. It is therefore, as I think, a very important question for the consideration of the American people, whether the policy of bringing in additional territory without considering at all how it will operate upon the safety of the Union in reference to this one great disturbing element in our national politics shall be adopted as the policy of the country. You will bear in mind that it is to be acquired, according to the judge's view, as fast as it is needed. And the indefinite part of this proposition is that we only have Judge Douglas and his class of men to decide how fast it is needed. We have no clear and certain way of determining or demonstrating how fast territory is needed by the necessities of the country. Whoever wants to go out filibustering then thinks that more territory is needed. Whoever wants wider slave fields feels sure that some additional territory is needed as slave territory. It is very easy to assert, but much less easy to disprove, that it is necessary for the wants of the country. Now it only remains for me to say that I think it is a grave question for the people of the Union to consider, whether in view of the fact that this slavery question has been the only one that has ever endangered our Republican institutions, the only one that has ever threatened or menaced a dissolution of the Union, that has ever disturbed us in such a way as to make us fear for the perpetuity of our liberty. In view of these facts, I think it is an exceedingly interesting and important question for the people of this country to consider, whether we shall engage in this policy of acquiring additional territory, discarding altogether from our consideration, while obtaining new territory, the question of how it may affect us in regard to this only endangering element to our liberties and national greatness. The judge's views have been expressed. I, in my answer to his question, have expressed mine. I think it will become an important and practical question. Our views are before the public. I am willing and anxious that they should consider them fully, and that they should turn it about and consider the importance of the question and arrive at a just conclusion as to whether it is or is not wise in the people of this Union and the acquisition of new territory to consider whether it will add to the disturbance that is existing amongst us, whether it will add to the only danger that has ever threatened the perpetuity of the Union, or our own liberties. I think it is extremely important that they shall decide, and rightly decide, that question before entering upon that policy. And now, my friends, having said the little I wish to say upon this head, whether I have occupied the whole or the remnant of my time, I know not, but I believe I could not enter upon any new topic so as to treat it fairly without transcending my time, which I would not for a moment think of doing. I give way to Judge Douglas.
The first criticism Mr. Lincoln makes on my speech is what I have said in substance everywhere in this state where I have addressed the public. I wish I could say the same of his speech. Why, the reason I complain of him is that he makes one speech north and another south, because he has one set of sentiments for the abolition counties and another set for the counties opposed to abolitionism. My point of complaint against him is that I cannot induce him to hold up the same standard, to carry the same flag in all parts of the state. He does not pretend, and no other man will, that I have one set of principles for Galesburg and another for Charleston. He does not pretend that I hold one doctrine in Chicago and an opposite one in Jonesboro. I have proved that he has a different set of principles for each of these localities. Here I understand him to reaffirm the doctrine of Negro equality and to assert that by the Declaration of Independence, the Negro is declared the equal to the white man. Mr. Lincoln asserts today, as he did at Chicago, that the Negro is included in that clause of the Declaration of Independence, which says that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the Negro was made his equal and mine, and if that equality is established by divine law and was the Negro's inalienable right, how came he to say at Charleston to the Kentuckians residing in that section of our state that the Negro was physically inferior to the white man, belonged to an inferior race, and he was for keeping him always in that inferior condition? I wish you to bear these things in mind. At Charleston, he said that the Negro belonged to an inferior race and that he was for keeping him in that inferior condition. There, he gave the people to understand that there was no moral question involved, that the inferiority being established, it was merely a matter of degree, not a matter of right. But here, today, instead of making it a question of degree, he makes it a moral question. Says that it's a great crime to hold the Negro in that inferior condition. Is he right now, or was he right in Charleston? Is he right then because, in your estimation, he can not be consistent, but because he can trim his principles in any way in any section so as to secure votes? All I desire of him is that he will declare the same principles in the South that he does in the North. But did you notice how he answered my position that a man should hold the same doctrines throughout the length and breadth of this republic? He said, would Judge Douglas go to Russia and proclaim the same principles he does here? I would remind him that Russia is not a part of the American Republic. If Russia were a part of the American Republic, under our federal Constitution, and I was sworn to support that Constitution, I would maintain the same doctrine in Russia that I do in Illinois. The slaveholding states are governed by the same federal Constitution as ourselves, and hence a man's principles, in order to be in harmony with the Constitution, must be the same in the South as they are in the North, the same in the free states as they are in the slave states. Whenever a man advocates one set of principles in one section and another set in another section, his opinions are in violation of the spirit of the Constitution, which he has sworn to support. when Mr. Lincoln went to Congress in 1847 and, laying his hand on the holy evangelists, made a solemn vow in the presence of high heaven to be faithful to the Constitution, what did he mean? The Constitution as he expounds it in Galesburg, or the Constitution as he expounds it in Charleston? I desired to conduct this contest with him like a gentleman, but when I asked him at Ottawa which resolutions formed the platform on which he stood, he did not answer, and I could not get an answer out of him. One cardinal point that he shrinks from is this: that there shall be no more slave states admitted to the Union, even if the people want them. Now, you Republicans all hurrah for him and for the doctrine of no more slave states, and yet Lincoln tells you that his conscience will not allow him to support that doctrine. You are one way, you confess, and he is, or claims to be, another, and yet you are both governed in principle to support one another. If it be true, as I have shown it is, that the whole Republican Party in the northern part of the state stands committed to the doctrine of no more slave states, and that this same doctrine is repudiated by the Republicans in the other part of the state, I wonder if Mr. Lincoln and his party do not present the case which he cited from scriptures of a house divided against itself which cannot stand. I desire to know what are Mr. Lincoln's principles and the principles of his party. I hold, and the party I am identified with hold, that the people of each state, old and new, have the right to decide the slavery question for themselves. And when I used the remark that I did not care if slavery was voted up or voted down, I used it in the connection that I was for allowing Kansas to do just as she pleased on the slavery question. Why cannot Abraham Lincoln and the party with which he acts speak out their principles so they may be understood? Why do they claim to be one thing in one part of the state and another thing in the other part? I have a few words to say upon the Dred Scott decision that has troubled the brain of Mr. Lincoln so much. He insists that that decision would carry the slavery into the free states, notwithstanding that the decision says directly the opposite. He goes into a long argument to make you believe that I am in favor of and would sanction the doctrine that would allow slaves to be brought here and held as slaves contrary to our Constitution and laws. Mr. Lincoln knows that there is not a member of the Supreme Court who holds that doctrine. Why this attempt to bring the Supreme Court into disrepute among the people? It looks as if an effort is being made to destroy public confidence in the highest judicial tribunal on earth. Suppose he succeeds in destroying public confidence in the court so that the people will not respect its decisions, but will feel at liberty to disregard them and resist the laws of the land. What will he have gained? He will have changed the government from one of laws into that of a mob. He complains because I did not go into an argument reviewing the Dred Scott decision. What use would that be? He wants to take an appeal from the Supreme Court to this meeting to determine whether the questions of law were decided properly. He's going to appeal from the Supreme Court of the United States to every town meeting in the hope that he can excite prejudice against the court, and on a wave of that prejudice, ride into the Senate of the United States when he could not get there on his own principles and his own merits. Suppose that he did succeed to get into the Senate of the United States. What then will he have to do with the decision of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case? Can he reverse the decision when he gets there? Can he act upon it? Has the Senate any right to reverse or revise it? He will not pretend that it has. Then why drag the matter into this contest unless for the purpose of making a false issue by which he can direct public attention away from the real issue? I ask him if he is not bound to respect and obey the decisions of the Supreme Court as well as me. The Constitution has created that court to decide all constitutional questions in the last resort. And when such decisions have been made, they become the law of the land. And you and he and myself and every other good citizen are bound by them. Yet he argues that I am bound by their decisions and he is not. Is it possible that you Republicans have the right to raise your mobs, oppose the laws of the land and the constituted authorities, and yet hold that Democrats are bound to obey them? All I have to say is that I stand by the law of the land. I stand by the Constitution as our fathers made it, by the laws as they are enacted, and by the decisions of the court upon all points within their jurisdiction as they are pronounced by the highest tribunal on earth. And any man who resists these must resort to mob law and violence to overturn the government of laws.
I want to say, I didn't realize that decaf coffee over there wasn't perked, but it is not. So anyone who wants some, there is some. Secondly, I'd like to say that some of you that are really good historians might have noticed that Mr. Lincoln here has a beard, and at the time of those debates he did not. But he has it because this February he is going to be the official Lincoln in Springfield, so he needs a beard for then. From the two actors or from Dr. Smelter over there, if you want to come up. If anyone has a question? Okay.
Personally, I wish to thank both you gentlemen for a job well done. It was a great debate.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Lincoln, I must say, I'm going to have a tough time voting Republican this year. I have a few questions. One, how many debates are you going to have this year? Two, what is the duration of an average debate? Three, what is the normal attendance of a debate? And are they inside or outside?
All right. Well, let's just start with the middle first, and then I'll go to the beginning and then the end. Well, first of all, the debates took largely in part of an audience of about 15,000, as was the witness to this debate. In fact, in preparing for this debate, I remember being somewhat amazed by whatever efforts Larry and I were making to slow the dialogue down, to arrest each sentence as we thought it should be arrested, that we still couldn't come up with the proper time that made the 3-hour frame that went into this Lincoln-Douglas debate.
Yes.
And what we
you just heard was 1/3 the length of the real debate.
Yes. Each of us gave a 30-minute speech here today. When we originally did this in '94, we gave the full 90 minutes of Lincoln and 90 minutes of Douglas, making for a 3-hour debate. And in that forum, it was set up that Douglas spoke for 1 hour, Lincoln spoke for 90 minutes, and Douglas rejoined for half an hour. But what we found out in the research, and what I continued to find out as the years went by, is that Lincoln and Douglas couldn't possibly address all 15,000 people. So what was craftily done, especially in this debate, is barkers were set up in the middle of the audience. And Lincoln and Douglas were both in-depth enough speakers where they knew if they hit a good point, they better wait for that barker out in the middle of the audience to reiterate that point so that the rest of the people in the community could hear the points. So Lincoln and Douglas were learning how to deal with crowds that size. But one thing that impressed me when I was studying for this debate, and I'll leave it to Larry to comment a little bit on this. And by the way, when these 7 debates started, Lincoln and Douglas had debated each other at least 50 times in Chicago alone from the Tremont Hotel, speaking from the 2nd floor. Tens of thousands of people would gather around that balcony at the Tremont House to listen to Lincoln and Douglas debate. And it was only the popularity of those Chicago debates that lifted it to the stage it finally came to in the 7 congressional districts. But why Douglas really won this debate, even though Lincoln gave his greatest speech, I think, in the debates, the 7 key debates, was on this day in Galesburg when he introduced that moral light speech. Lincoln was taking it to a new level. He was no longer going to listen to the criticism of his best friends telling him he's going to lose this election badly unless he learns how to debate this formidable opponent. Well, Lincoln probably didn't learn all the lessons he should have in debating Douglas, because what Douglas was so shrewd at is that he spoke German fluently. And when he went into Quincy's debate the next day, he went into the saloons after the debate and gave his entire speech again in German to make sure that all of his constituents knew exactly who to vote for. So there was a lot going on in politics that Lincoln was learning about. And I really do look at this time in history, if he wouldn't have had this formidable opponent to run against in that Senate seat, I don't think he could have ever taken on the job that he was about to take on in 2 years. Because it was in dealing with this man, he had to learn with some burning issues that happened the day he was brought into office. Yes.
Thank you for bringing up the barkers. In a crowd of 15,000, there would often be as many as 150 and 175 barkers. A speaker would speak very, very slowly, not even as fast as these gentlemen, because one barker up front could hear, and then the barker back had to hear what that barker said, and so on, going all the way back. So speeches usually were delivered about like I'm doing, making even the shortest ones internally long. Also, a good thing to remember is that notice that our parties as we know them today, conservative Republican, liberal Democratic, were reversed back. The Democratic Party was a party of Jackson, formed in 1828. It was a party of big business and southern slave interests, cotton and tobacco. The Republican Party was formed by social reformers in 1854. Abolitionists were just one group of them. There were suffragettes who wanted to vote for women. There were temperance people, people who wanted to reform the medical and mental institutions. And so, of course, not every Republican was an abolitionist, and not every Democrat was pro-slavery. Great Democratic contingent in the North. The Republicans, of course, completely buried the Whigs in the later 50s, and they ceased to exist. Now, when did they switch again? In 1865, the Republicans, having been tied at the hip with Northern business in the Civil War, became conservative. Everybody likes big contributions, and certainly CEOs contributed more than immigrant workers. Okay? And the Democrats were pushed to the left in 1896 by William Jennings Bryan as a result of the populist challenge. So from 1896 until today, they've been exactly what they have, conservative.
One of the ways that the debate did end up filling 3 hours is the thing that was missing from this debate, and that's your part.
Yes.
When we staged the debate in Galesburg, there were 200 people in the crowd who rehearsed with us, who knew when to shout and hoot and holler, and
Rehearsed for 3 months.
right.
3 months they rehearsed that.
So that was a dedicated group of people who listened to us deliver that 3-hour speech over and over and over
Yes.
again.
Yeah.
They deserved a medal.
Yes. And to really realize that was a big part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates too, the fervor of the crowd and the political bents that were involved, yeah. There was a question out there? Yes.
I wonder if anybody knows to what extent Lincoln knew about William Wilberforce and had heard his speeches and read his works.
I will turn that to you.
There is, that's one of the great rumors of history, okay? That's one of the great rumors of history.
you would say that.
Do politicians get ideas from other people's speeches? Okay, now I'm not going to mention the name, but one of the contenders in the election has been accused of doing it. Okay? Can it be done inadvertently? Of course. Do I think that Lincoln plagiarized Wilberforce's
Not
speeches?
plagiarized, was influenced. He was known all over the world at that time.
Oh, I would have no doubt that Lincoln read his works. But of course, there were many, many people who influenced Lincoln. You have to have the man here to say, to what extent has he influenced? No one can answer that question.
You know who it is.
And I still live to this day in my heart and soul, knowing how much Lincoln was influenced by Shakespeare. Throughout the Civil War, Lincoln was quoted as saying he looked at Shakespeare as being the master of the human condition. And I can't believe that many of Lincoln's day-to-day processes were influenced by the historical tales of William Shakespeare.
Any other questions? Yes.
All 50 debates were not on slavery. What were some of the other issues?
I did some research on that, and unfortunately, we lost many of those Lincoln Douglas speeches that were given at the Tremont House, my understanding anyway, in the Chicago fire, is what happened to so many. Robert Lincoln had Lincoln's court transcripts brought up to Chicago, kept in what he thought was a safe place in Chicago. And in 1872, we almost lost every document and court transcript of Lincoln's. And a lot of it happened in the speeches that Lincoln would give in Chicago, except for the famous ones when he did the, after Taylor's death, and other great, the sandbar incident, whatever incident you want to bring up in Chicago. If it was famous enough for the press to be there, biased and unbiased, it would be covered and probably preserved in history. But in many cases, Lincoln and Douglas spoke, and even one of Lincoln's more famous speeches, the Serenade speech, which was given on the night of re-election, talking about, you know, nobody in the country knew the result of the election. It was the same thing. There was only one unbiased reporter in the audience, and we only have his word to go by, what Lincoln really said that night. But I'm willing to bet, and some of my research has shown me, and perhaps you can elaborate on this more, what they were really propounding is what was the direction with new territory and states' rights. Popular sovereignty was the debate these men entered, and everything else that grew out of it in these famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, the moral high ground that Lincoln switched it to. Most of the earlier debates, I believe, and there are questions and discussions back and forth, and sometimes even in complete agreement about them, was the issue of popular sovereignty. The question whether a state has its own rights to make up its own constitutions and live by its own laws.
I think you have to remember, too, that popular sovereignty was not the only catchword at the time. The other was manifest destiny.
Yes, of course.
What is to be done with the great American interior? Can the American Indian be pushed into tighter reservations? Manifest destiny, of course, fueled the Mexican-American War, which many people saw as a very unjust war at the time. There was a panicky paranoia in the later 1850s. Every time a territory, a western territory, particularly a southern western one, which had the same climate that could sustain the cotton business. Cotton can be grown as far west as eastern Texas. Every time a territory would say, we've got the prerequisite number of people who are applying for statehood to the Union, everybody would go nuts. Are they going to come in as free or slaves? Everybody look around desperately to find another one to keep the balance in the Senate. Now people say, well, why didn't the Vice President of the United States, if there ever was a time in the Senate, why couldn't the Vice President simply come over and make that? There would not be any Vice President at the time who would have the guts to go into that august body and transgress the Democratic or Republican. They would do it. They'd hide under the bed.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there any evidence that these debates affected the election? Was Illinois pro-Lincoln before the debates? And then...
Well, it's just general knowledge that this thrust through these debates thrust Lincoln onto the national stage. We all knew of him in Illinois at the time just because of his political stances and political stumping for Henry Clay or whoever it may be.
Yeah, he was pretty much of a loser until he
Yes.
became president.
Yes. Having lost so many elections right in Illinois, you know, having lost so much, and to think he
Yeah, he
stayed
lost
in-
this one.
Yeah, he lost this one too. But I guess it was really, you had your Oliver Wendell Holmes, you had so many great writers on the East Coast that were so influenced by these debates that put Lincoln on that national pedestal, that made him a national figure because everyone felt the same way. No one just articulated it like Lincoln had. And I think how Lincoln really reached people and what was cut out of what we did today is Lincoln's brilliance with analogy. And one of my favorite analogies, before I'll let you speak on this, Lincoln could always speak to a crowd like this. When the shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, to the sheep he is a liberator. But to the wolf, the same act defines the shepherd as the destroyer of all liberty. So it appears that the wolf and the sheep are not yet agreed upon the proper definition of liberty. And that is precisely the same difference that exists amongst us human creatures. Lincoln could reach that man in that audience by making that analogy. A man who had less than maybe education than even Lincoln did. But he could take a brilliant analogy that Lincoln could make and translate it into his own life. And what I found out in these debates and studying him as closely as I did is Lincoln would oftentimes repeat himself. Maybe not in a way we recognize, but he would reiterate a point by driving another analogy home around it and then using that key sentence to finish off that analogy with. So I think that was his brilliance. He could speak to everyone in the audience, even though, unlike Douglas, he couldn't speak that foreign language to reach that German crowd. He could reach any member of that crowd in the English language.
I think in 1858, it would have been almost impossible for Abraham Lincoln to beat Stephen A. Douglas. Douglas was a phenomenally well-known national figure at the time. He was credited, because of the Compromise of 1850, for saving the Union. Southerners had been talking about seceding from the Union, and something wasn't done. If California comes as a free state, we don't have a slave state. And many people thought that he prevented civil war in 1850. The man was the little giant, not only of Illinois, but national. And Lincoln, here his party was only in existence for 4 years. Once again, Barack Obama coming out of nowhere, impressing people with the skill of his oratory. And then catapulted to the presidency a couple years later. 530,000 deaths for a civil war.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. And I want to let you know, I think you might have noticed that it was being taped. The program was taped and it will premiere on our library cable network, Channel 24, in February, just in time for the actual 200th Lincoln birthday. So if you want to watch it again or tell someone that you know, they can see it in February on Library Cable Network. It will also be a tape that will be available in the library's collection. So thanks everyone for coming. And remember the other Lincoln programs.
And if there's one thing I'm sure Lincoln would say, you better get out and vote. Yes, sir.
May I get a picture with
Oh, yes.
you?